Hi, I'm Pia. I'm an economic researcher and I teach macroeconomics. In this video, we're going to learn about one of the main problems associated to prices in the long run, that is, inflation. In order to do so, we're going to start by defining how money and prices behave in the long run. Then we're going to go over the concept of inflation, how it is measured, and its impacts. This will allow us to study the main theories surrounding inflation. And finally, we're going to analyze what causes inflation. With this content, you'll be able to understand the drivers of inflation and how it affects the economy. Let's begin. Money and prices are key to establish the difference between short run and long run in macroeconomics. We know that the long run is equivalent to a significant period of time. But what does that mean? The first thing that we have to keep in mind is price flexibility. Price flexibility is not the same for all goods and services. That is why in macroeconomics we use an assumption in order to simplify and establish the difference between the short run and the long run. This assumption consists on the fact that the prices of final products sold to consumers are more flexible than input prices. In other words, the cost of each factor of production used to produce a final good or service is more inflexible in the short term than the price of the final good itself. What's the most common example? Wages. Wages are the payments for labor, which is an input used for most final products. Wages have two main qualities. They are adjusted periodically and not automatically, and they have downward inflexibility, which means as they adjust, they are unlikely to be reduced. Those qualities are significantly different from final products, which can adjust their prices more quickly. So, the short run consists on the time horizon over which the wages and prices of other inputs to production are inflexible. Within this time frame, it is assumed that there may be imbalances, since some prices may have adjusted to changes in market conditions, those of final products, while others have not, those of the inputs. And the long run consists on the period of time over which these input prices have the time to adjust. In this case, the overall price level, contractual wage rates, and expectations are fully adjusted in equilibrium, which allows us to make analysis regarding GDP and general prices. So what is inflation? Inflation is a percentage rate which measures the variation between the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, of the current year versus the CPI of the base year. As you can see, the equation is the inflation rate, which is the difference between the CPI on the current year or year T and the CPI from the base year, and then we divide it by the CPI of the base year. Inflation is also defined by a sustained increase in the average level of the prices in the economy. This means that all the goods and services, at least the ones we all consume, are getting more expensive. We all pay the same for said products. A carton of milk costs the same for either a rich person and a poor person. As a consequence, if prices are rising, poor sectors will have a harder time purchasing the same amount of products since they use a larger proportion of their income. In other words, its impact is unequal, since it implies a general loss of purchasing power. People will consume less and demand higher wages, and producers will have higher input costs. This can turn into a recession or drop in economic activity, which is caused when the loss in consumption and investment generate a fall in the general level of output. There are many theories based on inflation and what causes it. The classical theory of inflation is supported by the Fisher equation of exchange. This theory states that each transaction that's made within the economy is done by using money. When you go to the supermarket, the hairdresser, or to a restaurant, you give money to a provider in exchange for a good or a service. The Fisher equation of exchange states that money supply equals nominal GDP. This equation is put in simpler terms. Let's analyze it. On the right side, we have a simplified version for calculating nominal GDP, which is overall prices, or P, on your screen, multiplied by total output, or real GDP. This is Y on your screen. On the left side, we have the money needed to carry out all the exchanges included on the right side. M will be the money supply, and V the velocity at which it circulates. How does this equation represent the quantity theory of money? It basically represents that you need X amount of money to buy X amount of goods. This theory has many implications. First of all, assuming that V is constant, if output increases, the money supply will have to increase as well. Then, if money supply increases but output doesn't, then prices will increase. These two implications are associated to what we call monetary economics or monetarism. One of its main statements is that the money supply in an economy determines the value of money. So, if there's more money available, its value will decrease. This causes inflation and loss in purchasing power. All other things being equal, if money supply rises, prices will rise at the same rate. This is supposed to happen in all price levels and eventually generate a rise in the amount of inflation. This means that the quantity theory of money supports the fact that inflation is a monetary effect. One of its main speakers was Milton Friedman, who said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. This saying implies that governments have a huge responsibility towards controlling inflation, because it affects economic activity. Not only prices rise when money supply increases. When people lose purchasing power, they consume less. If there's an overall decrease in consumption, this means that eventually output will fall as well. This is why monetarism states that governments should implement policies that influence the money supply as a way of fostering economic growth. However, this influence should be controlled in order to avoid generating the opposite effect. In line with this last concept, monetarists advise governments that non-inflationary policy, such as steady reduction in the money supply, could guide an economy to full employment rather than continuously adjusting fiscal policy through changes in government spending and taxation levels. Also, if controlled below the rate of output growth, an increase in money supply could even act as a boost for GDP. Keynesian economics, however, are quite opposed to this way of thinking. In the 1930s, Keynes questioned the quantity theory of money, arguing that changes in the money supply could affect the velocity of money. Keynesian economists claim that there are two types of inflation: cost push and demand pull. Demand pull inflation happens when consumer demand for goods outweighs supply, presumably as a result of the increased money supply. Cost push inflation is when consumer preferences change more slowly than input prices for goods, sometimes as a result of a higher money supply. So, if we put everything together, we can discuss what causes inflation. First of all, we have both cost push and demand pull, which belong to the Keynesian theory. Then, a loss of value for money, which according to monetarist economists, can be caused by either a not controlled expansionary monetary policy or not applying contractionary monetary policy when money supply has grown too large. But also, there are other phenomena which has been proved to cause inflation in different contexts, such as built-in inflation, which happens when population expects inflation to continue in the future. This generates behavioral changes for both consumers and producers. Imagine you know prices will rise tomorrow. Will you try to buy more things today before they get more expensive? Also, expansionary fiscal policies such as tax decreases or increases in government spending can increase activity in a way that it spurs consumption, wages, investment, and eventually prices. The exchange rate can also be considered, since an increase can generate higher demand for exports or less demand for local currency. However, it is important that inflation can be caused by many factors, and it usually varies according to the context of each economy. So which are the most common mistakes? First of all, inflation is a sustained increase in overall prices. I know I'm just repeating the definition, but it's so you can remember these two key words, sustained and gen. There is no inflation if the price for TVs has increased because of the World Cup. That represents one product with a higher price because of additional costs. However, if the price for oil increases, they will probably cause inflation. Why is that? Because it's a commodity that affects the prices of a large amount of goods, since it's used for transportation. People driving cars will have to pay more for gas, transportation for goods will get more expensive, and prices for those goods may increase. People will demand higher wages, and so on. Also, many people mistake the concept of money neutrality to the fact that monetary policy has no effect. Money neutrality expresses that monetary policy should be used in a limited and monetary way in order to be effective. With everything we just covered, it's time for a quick exercise. Let's go back to the Fisher equation and imagine that output increases. According to the classical theory of inflation or monetarism, what can the government do to avoid inflation? If you answer to institute a contractive monetary policy, you are correct. Remember, monetarists support the idea that in order to prevent economic growth from causing inflation, monetary policy should control the money supply. Wrapping up, we've seen in this video what inflation means, its causes, and its impacts. Inflation consists of a sustained increase in the average price level in the economy. This generates a loss in purchasing power, which means that prices for consumers and producers will be higher. So, ceteris paribus, consumption and investment are likely to decrease. So try to apply this on the current context. What do you think is causing inflation during 2022? Or should I say fueling? Hope you have enjoyed this video, and also if you want to learn more, please feel free to explore about the topic on Chegg.